Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the That Was Stupid podcast. We are in an all-new season, and I am so excited to have you joining us. Today is a treat. I know I say that a lot, right? Whatever. I get over it. But it is a treat because I have one of my favorite people in the world, someone I've known for years, and you might know him as well. Today's guest is Billy Hallowell. Billy is one of the most prominent faith journalists in the entire country, and I like to say that I helped give him his start, which we are going to talk about today. But first, before we do and get into it, just remember, this episode is brought to you by the Veritas Creative. The Veritas Creative is your full-service digital media consulting agency. They can help you put together videos, Facebook posts, new website, whatever you can dream or need in the digital space, they can do. Please visit them at theveritascreative.com. So, like I said, we have Billy Hallowell, and this is going to be a fun conversation because Billy and I, like I said, go back a very long way. I helped give him his start, and so he's going to talk about a couple that was stupid moments, and one of them is how he decided to get into journalism, and another one is how he actually first approached me in order to land his first big faith gig, and we're going to talk about it a lot along the way. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Billy Hallowell. William H. Hallowell. So glad. I think that's an H, right?
It is. It's a Harris. William Harris Hallowell, the third.
It sounds like you could have been on a 3-hour tour, like you were like the professor out there. Well, anyways, as you can see, this podcast is going to be probably one of the most fun that I've had up to this point. Nothing against previous guests, but Billy Hallowell is an old friend of mine. And every time we talk and get together, it just ends up being a blast. And so really, we're inviting you into a conversation talking about Billy's past, how he got to where he is, and some advice for other people who need to take a plunge. So, Billy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I've been watching all these episodes, and I've been like, when am I coming on this show? And now I'm here, and I'm excited.
Well, and we had to move heaven and earth. Billy had to reschedule. I had to reschedule. Like we were supposed to do this earlier in the week, and then I had to have an emergency root canal, which is not a lot of fun.
That sounded a lot of fun.
Man.
So.
My goodness. Yeah, maybe that becomes a That Was Stupid podcast episode in itself. But here we are. So we're finally here. It's finally happening. Billy, I like to start out with people by saying, okay, what do you do now? Right? Because everyone can kind of see where people are at now.
So my full-time job, what I do now is I'm a digital host and a writer at CBN News, Christian Broadcasting Network. I also write a column for Washington Times. So I do a lot of hosting, a lot of writing. But that's a quick overview of it. And I'm an author like you as well. So yeah, a lot going on in media.
And so, but you weren't, I know you've been doing this for a while, but the first you kind of have two, what I call anchor That Was Stupid stories. And so we're going to talk about both of them. But the first one kind of takes you back pretty far, right? I mean, you're 15 years old, and I'm excited about this because I hope that people listening, whether they're young people listening or more mature people who want to pass this on to younger people, I think you have a great message encapsulated in this first That Was Stupid moment and story. So take us back. Your first That Was Stupid story and moment deals with your family and you deciding what you want to do with the rest of life, and everyone's like, that's stupid.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because I had... I would actually go back to April 20th, 1999, because that day for me, it stands out in my mind so much. It was the day of the Columbine shooting. And I was a freshman in high school, lived in New York, nowhere near Colorado, no connection to it whatsoever. But I think like a lot of other people, I was actually homesick from school, and I'll never forget it. my dad had the news on. I'm watching these kids run out of their school, and it was just horrific. And I kept thinking, gosh, this could happen in my school. This could happen anywhere. And it just had such an impact on me. And I won't get into all the details, but it sort of sent me on this journey of what can I do to stop something like that at my school or in my community? And I started pitching TV shows to local producers for teenagers. I tried to do all these different things, and I had no clue what I was doing. But there were a number of people who kind of brought me under their wing. And one person suggested that I should write, that I should start a column. And it was really crazy because within a couple of years, I was writing. I mean, I was 15 years old at the time. I'm going to be 40 this year. And it's crazy because that journey, really started at 15 into media, and I didn't realize it at the time. And so I started a website, and I was doing all this work for free. I wasn't getting paid for it, but I really felt this calling, and I didn't fully understand what it was. And when it came time at 18, 3 years later, to make a decision, I really felt deeply called, and we can get into more of those details, but deeply called to be a journalist, to go into media, to build on those things that day in April, that horrible day that I watched on TV, that sort of passion to try to do something to stop it. I felt like storytelling was the way to do that, and that I was being called there. And, whenever you're making a decision about what you're going to do for the rest of your life, it's a scary decision to make, and you're a teenager and you're trying to figure it out. But I felt that calling so strongly. And I had people around me in my family who were close to me, not my parents, but others who were incredibly negative about that decision. I mean, I had people saying, this is stupid. You're going to go to college and look, you have to be discerning about these things, but you're going to spend tens of thousands of dollars to get a degree in journalism or writing. It's very hard to become a writer. Nobody pays you, when you do become one generally, and you're going to set yourself up for failure. And that was a real struggle because you're kind of at a crossroads of, okay, they're telling me this is stupid. This is what I feel called to do. Am I going to listen to what I feel called to do by God? And again, I didn't fully understand it all. Or am I going to listen to these people who are wise and they've lived their life and maybe they know more than I do? And so I really had a deep, deep struggle with that.
Before we go any further, what did you, either growing up or at that point, what did you think you wanted to do with your life?
I mean, since I can remember, and this is really interesting, and it's showed me now that I'm older and I have a deeper relationship with Christ and I understand my faith, I can see the breadcrumbs throughout my life of God pointing me toward media. I was always really interested in sort of entertainment and media and messaging. I mean, when I was in like second grade, I was making a newspaper with friends at school. I was making a magazine. I was like, that was stuff that we'd like print out these ridiculous papers and like try to, and like pass it around because we didn't have access to printers at the time.
I would not give to see Billy's little magazine from middle school.
It's probably horrifying. I mean, this started like early elementary school. I was doing it in middle school. So I always had that kind of that interest in that calling and that pull. And I was always really interested in New York City. And I lived in upstate New York, but I had never been in New York City. I just knew that's where messages come from, right? Like at the time, that's how I thought about everything. And I had this feeling like God is going to I'm going to end up living in New York, right? And I think people thought that was crazy and stupid too, because most of my family stayed local, got local jobs, which is fine, but I didn't have that calling. So yeah, there was just kind of these breadcrumbs throughout. And I love now being able to look back and be like, wow, God really does. And we have to be discerning about that voice to make sure it's coming from God, but he really does set us on paths and we have to make the decisions ultimately, but he kind of sets us up for following in his path. So anyway, I don't know what the original question was, but I wanted to say all that.
Well, it doesn't matter because that was great. That was a great response. So, no, I was just talking about like what you thought you want to do growing up, and so I actually love that, right? Because I think even in my own life, I kind of look back. I went to college not to be a writer, right? I went to college, and actually, we're going to talk about this in your second story. I went to college because I thought I was going to be in politics for the rest of my life, right? Like I had a dream to be the next press secretary of the United States. Go to college and, I have a professor kind of speak into me that says like recognizes my talents and says, I think you need to think about writing. Right. And then you kind of look back. I was just writing an article this week where I took an approach where instead of writing an article, I wrote a poem. And I remembered that I used to write poems all the time growing up. Now, again, I'm not going to release those. Maybe those will be the secret papers of John Seidel later.
I want that sketch pad. I
like,
want that book in your handwriting of all your poems about, My Little Ponies or whatever else you wrote poems about. I don't know, but I would love to see it.
It literally is a small little book that I have that like is tucked away somewhere, and I see it every once in a while. Like I'm rummaging and trying to find something, and I'll see it, and I just I don't even open it, right? Because I'm just I'm embarrassed.
I wrote songs. I wrote songs. So I wrote songs as a kid, and I don't know why. And I have to tell you this, and this is crazy. I mean, I don't know, it's a side note, but my grandfather, my dad's dad, and he did a lot of random jobs, but he actually was a songwriter. I never knew this until I was older. And his father was a newspaper editor. I mean, these things that you don't know. Wow. And it's like, wow. And you start to kind of think are these things passed on in some way? I didn't even know that, right? But anyway, I have songs that I wrote, and I have a folder with them that I never look at. It's the same thing, and it's hidden away. And, my kids will probably find it after I die and be horrified. But yeah, it's, I've got that.
You're like my grandfather wrote songs. He wrote this little song called "Let It Be" that some guy John Lennon eventually found.
He recorded them. It's funny. I just got records. He didn't sing them. There was a guy, but he would do the writing. Anyway, so it's interesting how these things are even passed on in families too. These traits and these journeys sometimes.
So, a lot of times we save in these episodes the lessons for the end. But since we have kind of two big anchor stories, I want to ask you this question. As a young, if a young person is listening to this, if, someone who's going to send this to a young person is listening to this, what is your advice or recommendation when it comes to pursuing something that maybe even your family is saying isn't wise or smart? And how do you balance that idea of, man, I really feel like this is what I'm supposed to do, but I also want to respect those around me and listen to them, and they are wise. Like, how do you toe that line? What's your advice there?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, and this comes from my faith, it's how I approach things now. At the end of the day, we need to be in prayer. We need to be listening to God, and that needs to be the voice we listen to. And ideally, some of these family members were not believers, right? So they weren't people who were going to be going to prayer for me on this or going to prayer on it in general. They were giving opinions based on practicality, what they thought. And that's not bad always to hear practicality. We need to hear that. It's easy to be like, I want to do this job because it's so great and I'm so attracted to it. And then it's a disaster because you didn't plan well. But I think seeking God first, which I know is such a simple answer, but so many times we get an idea in our head and we're going for that idea and we're no longer considering all of the things it takes to get there, all of the ramifications of not planning it well. If it's not something that God has for us, I mean, look around. There are lots of people who have millions, if not billions of dollars. They have fame, they have fortune. They did not listen to God to get where they are, most likely, and they're making decisions that might even fly directly in the face of God, and yet they have that success. So success is possible, of course, and monumental success is possible. But if you didn't listen to God to get there, you're not on the track you're supposed to be on. And so when it comes to that balance, I always say, listen to everybody, take all the information in. And that's what I tried to do at the time. I had parents who were believers who knew. I mean, look, when I got the acceptance to the college I ended up going to in New York City, I threw it in the garbage because I was like, I don't know that college. I don't want to go there. And my dad took it out of the garbage and said, you have no idea what God might have for you. It turned out I got a big scholarship and I was able to go to that college, right? So again, it's taking all that information in and respectfully listening, but listening to the voice of God at the end of it, because he's the one who's going to lead us where we're supposed to go.
So now you fast forward, and I would say you are one of, if not the most popular evangelical faith reporters. What have some of those family members that were detractors and were kind of your "that was stupid" people back then? What are they saying now?
I think that, I mean, I know that they're very proud and they'll say, we're really proud of you, but we've never addressed like those initial conversations. I mean, there's one conversation I remember that was very, very harsh, about how stupid this was. And how unintelligent it was. I do think they're proud though. And they understand maybe now that they were wrong. They may not say it, but they understand that they were wrong. And I think, by the way, the other piece of this is we have to be careful what we're saying to other people. You and me, other people come to us, they ask for advice. And a lot of times I go for the most practical piece, right? Like I will do the same thing. It's like, well, does this make sense? But I have to remember to encourage people to listen to God's voice first too, because you don't want to be that person who ends up being the subject of an interview, even though I'm not using the name, years later because you gave the wrong advice, right? So I think, it's changed how I also discuss other people's lives with them.
Yeah, that's really good, right? And I think it kind of on a similar scale, or to put this in perspective, I have a friend who just told me that they were pregnant, right? And one of the pieces of advice I gave him was, you are going to see a lot of different people giving you advice. Like if you look up, sleep training, right? You're going to have one blog that tells you to do it this way and has facts and data and opinion to justify, or experience, I should say, to justify what they believe. And then you're going to have an opposite point of view over here. And that person's going to have the same, data experience to back up theirs. Right. And so you have to sift through that. And that doesn't mean that, their experience is their experience, right? That's great. But you have to figure out through, you said, prayer and taking that to a chorus of people to figure out what is being said to you, right? And so when I worked for Kirk Cameron, he had this saying, and he didn't make it up, but he would use it a lot, said, eat the meat and spit out the bones. And I think that it's a very simple phrase, and I think it's very appropriate.
Yeah, no, 100%. I think, our go-to as human beings is to go to what we know and what we've experienced when we're giving advice to people. And I don't know. I look back on all of it and I'm like, man, had I listened to those relatives, right, I would not have the career I have, most likely. I'm sure God could have found another way of course he could have found another way or another path, but wouldn't have met my wife because we met at that college, wouldn't have my 2 kids, right? And it's the power of decisions and the decisions that God leads us toward, right? And, I even think down to the most granular, like my youngest has severe scoliosis, and, we live in New York. We have amazing, not that there isn't great medical care other places, but for what she's dealing with, there are doctors here that she needs, right? Like I think about all of it and I'm like, my goodness, like she has everything she needs here, and God just knew what I would need, and he knew how he was going to use me. And so, the challenge is making sure you stay on and you keep listening to that message, because it's easy. And there were times that I deviated from that message, even on the journey. So you kind of have that decision that was stupid moment. You go to college for journalism. But what's interesting, and this is where our stories start to intersect. What's interesting, though, is you ended up not right away working in it, right? And so I think even some of those people, I know you were doing some writing for free and you were writing kind of on the side, but I remember when we met, I was living in New York City with my wife, and she was working at a nonprofit ministry with you, like you both were working at the ministry, and you went to her and so take us to that moment and that period of your story. What were you doing? Yeah. And how did it lead to us getting to know each other? Yeah, it's such a weird, and this is why I always tell people, work really hard and keep showing up, because when you do that, God works it out, right? But I had kind of said to myself, it was like, okay, God, you got me here. You brought me to this school. I'm doing the journalism thing. And then I sort of stopped. I didn't say, and this is where the stupidity on my part came in. I was like, I'm going to talk about politics now. That's all I'm going to talk about. God, I'm not going to ask you what you want me to talk about, because this is what I want to do. So very similar to you, that passion of politics, which, I was doing weekly hits for Fox News, even during this time, for Fox News Strategy Room, which used to be their online outfit. But at that point, I had been working at a political nonprofit. I became the executive director, then it closed down and I was laid off. And I was like, okay, God, I had just gotten married, actually, I believe at the time. Yeah, I was about to get married. And I'm thinking, what am I going to do? Like, I don't have this job. It was paying well. And it was the most humbling experience, because I took a job at a Christian nonprofit, great organization, but my pay was cut in half immediately, right? And I was like, I do not want to do this, God. I don't want to work in a development fundraising position. This isn't even in media. And I was just like, okay, I'll take the job for a couple of months because I got the job, and then I'll move on. And God kept me there for a couple of years. And the whole time I'm like, God, why are you? So I hadn't asked what topic he wanted me to cover, but I'm asking God, what are you doing? Like, why am I here? And the people were great. It just wasn't where I wanted to be. And then I met your wife, right? We were working in the same office, and it was a weird circumstance because our office was under construction. So they were sending me to go work in Manhattan. And that's where she was, right? So I wouldn't have even met her had we not had this construction project. And so I've been there about 2 years, and she starts to tell me about this guy that she's married to who works at The Blaze, which was a website I knew, really well. And I was doing the Fox News thing on the side, whenever I could for free. And I thought, well, maybe I could bother this woman so much that she gets me a lunch meeting with her husband, John. And I'm sure you were like, who's this weirdo who won't leave my wife alone? Yeah, and she's probably like, please just meet with him so that he will leave me alone.
Totally.
So she sets up the lunch, right? And you and I meet. And I remember we were at the Chipotle.
Right by Bryant Park.
Yep. And, we sat down and we met. And I feel like we hit it off pretty well right away. I was like, oh, this guy's really cool. You were a couple years younger than me. We're around the same age. And I'm like, this is cool. And I had applied for The Blaze a number of times and never heard anything. I think it was in the abyss of an email box somewhere. And then what did you do from there? How did you, we left that meeting and then.
Yeah. So that's, I'm glad we get to see it from both perspectives. So yes, my wife, she comes home from work one day. She's like, hey, there's this guy in the office. I think he's legit, but he keeps kind of talking about The Blaze and politics. And so at that point we had launched The Blaze. I was the first writing hire at The Blaze, and we launched it in 2010, and it, obviously we thought it was going to be successful. Otherwise we wouldn't have started it, and I went to, taking the job there. But it became wildly successful, overnight, right? And so, I think this was probably a year into it, or so, and because of that success, we were getting hit up a lot, right? People that wanted to, join the organization, and that kind of stuff. And so you just kind of start tuning some of that stuff out. And so I'm sure that's what happened, right? We would get emails and messages from all over the world saying, I've got a buddy who's a writer, and you're just like, listen, if I were to take time to respond to all of those, I wouldn't get my job done. But when your wife comes and she's like, hey, listen, this guy, he's talking about it. I think you should meet with him. Can you please meet with him? Because it will be awkward if you do not for me.
And then he'll leave me alone.
Yeah. So I'm like, yeah, okay. So we set up this meeting, and we meet, and I'm like, dang, okay, I'm so glad I did this. This guy is smart. He's fun. He's funny. We hit it off. And so I immediately left that conversation. I seriously remember, it was either a text or a call. I think it might have been a call. I texted my boss, who was the editor-in-chief of the whole thing. And I said, hey, there's this guy, Billy Hallowell. My wife just set up a meeting. We really need to hire him. And he's like, oh, okay. And I think then I set up a meeting with you and him, and it went really well. But what's funny is now, and this goes to another that was stupid. So that was, by the way, let me pause there. That was stupid of you took a job, and I did this. I talked with a mutual friend of ours, Jason Romano, on the podcast, who left ESPN to take a 40% pay cut. You got laid off, but what made you take a job at a nonprofit doing development for 40% less money? Are you like, hey, listen, I got to feed my family, or what went into that decision?
I prayed about it, and it was one of those reluctant things. And I wasn't as strong at that point. I would say I had a really good head knowledge of Christianity. I had grown up in the church, but I knew I knew the mechanics of what I needed to do. And I was praying about it, and I really felt like I don't want to take this job. And by the way, I was living in Yonkers or Dobbs Ferry at the time, which is in Westchester, New York. So it's this was in Queens, this job. So this is a massive commute and I don't like the subway. So it's on the subway, it's on, and I'm like, anyway, so every part of it was sort of stacked against why would I do this? But there was the prayer, and then there was, well, I could go from having the money I had before to half, or I could go to having no money. And that, my wife wasn't making much at the time, and I'm thinking we got to pay for our rent. And I was like, okay, I'm just going to take this. And I really did see it as, and I know this is terrible to admit, but this is the truth. Like, if I get another job in 2 weeks, I'm out. Like, if I get a better job in 2 weeks, I'm leaving. And I didn't leave for 2 years. Like, and the work, it was interesting because the work was dealing with inner city homelessness. It was raising money to deal with that subject matter. And so I think it was another one of those things where God was going to show me some things through that job. And then it was like Noah's Ark came and swept me up in the form of you and your wife. And it was great. And I got to go to the Blaze. So it was, but again, that listening to God and waiting, because if I didn't wait those 2 years, I knew that he wanted me to stay there. I stayed and I didn't understand it. I wouldn't have met Brett, your wife, and I wouldn't have ended up meeting you. Right.
Yeah. Okay. So we took that little pause. Now let's go back. You meet my boss, who then becomes your boss, Scott Baker, one of the greatest bosses I've ever had. Great man. And
Amazing.
He offers you kind of two positions, right? And so and this decision, I think, really sets you on the course that you are now. So explain that decision and how you made it.
Yeah, it's so funny, right? And I'm not comparing myself to Jonah here at all. But I was just reading. I'm not. I'm just going to, let me preface it. But we were just reading. I was reading Jonah with the kids, and we were talking about it. And it's like, Jonah did not want to go to Nineveh. He's trying everything he can not to go to Nineveh. And, he ends up getting, we know the story. He gets eaten by the big fish, essentially. He's there for 3 days. He ends up getting spit out. He ends up doing the job in the end that he's supposed to do. He's not happy about what happens in the end, which is that people come back to the Lord. But he does it. And for me, I wanted that political position so badly, right? And it's like, I want to talk about politics all day long. And the two positions that were open, I think it was evening editor or faith editor. And I thought, I've been a Christian my whole life, right? Like, I've gone to church my whole life. I do love God. I don't know what that'll look like, but when I had those two options, I thought, well, I wish there was something in politics and something a little more newsy. But I prayed about it, and I was like, I'm going to take this faith reporter position. And I have to tell you, and you know this because we wrote thousands of stories.
Thousands.
Over 10,000 minimum. During that time. And it was the most rewarding. It was like God was basically like, here, I'm spitting you out here in this position. You're going to do this faith position. And it was another one of those things where I thought, maybe I'll do this for a year or two, and then I'll be a senior editor, or I don't know what I thought. I was like, or I'll get to go into politics. And I started loving the subject matter so much, right? Like that we were able to cover things and do really unique things. And it was such... I can't describe to people, and I don't know if you want to try, working at the Blaze as a team, we were like a family, and we're still like family. I mean, you and I, all of our relationships are so tight, years, more than a decade later after this. But God, anyway, brought me through and really just showed me how amazing this faith content was, and it set me on course to every job I've had since, really. I mean, it's incredible.
So two things. First of all, to your comment about the team, like that first team, right, that we were on, which by the way, like that first team, people have gone on to do amazing things, like senior positions at CNN and columnist positions in Washington, and I mean, just all sorts of things, right? Some people that would probably not want to admit that they were part of that team now because of the positions they're in, and we'll just leave it at that. But what is so funny to me is like we were in sync, right? It was really that, like, when you think about like Thunderbirds, right? And like the lead guy, turns to the right, and then everyone in perfect unison, kind of moves. And so that was so fun and awesome. And then I think what is so cool, the second thing I would say is that faith, we called them verticals, right? We had like a tech vertical, a faith vertical. That faith vertical ended up becoming our most popular vertical. And we knew we wanted to incorporate faith stories at the Blaze, but I don't think like Scott and I, when we first kind of started talking about that idea, I don't think we realized it would become the most popular, the most revenue generating then at that point. And what's funny is all because of a guy who didn't want the job, didn't want to write about faith, wanted to talk about politics.
And it's funny because we expanded that vertical to faith and culture at one point. We were like, okay, and absolutely. I mean, it was like, this is my foot in the door here. And it ended up being the biggest blessing. And I mean, think about the people who came through the door. I just talked the other day with Willie and Corey Robertson from Duck Dynasty again. And it's like that relationship was set during the Blaze time. I mean, so many people realized the value of that vertical and the power of it. And they would come to us with TV shows, the things they were working on, and we would get to talk with them. But it really, for me, opened up my eyes, not only, and I don't know why, obviously the content, I think that's why God did it, to bring this content out to people. For me, though, it brought me deeper into my faith. The more we were exploring all of those issues and interviewing all those people, the more that head knowledge for me turned into heart knowledge, right? And it equipped me to be able to lead my family. I mean, as well as possible. We're always on a journey of learning, right? I'm still learning, but all of that position for me was so life-changing. One of the hardest things for all of us, I think, was leaving that place, right? Because of that. But I am so grateful to your wife and to you and, to that experience, because I think everything else that has happened since has been rooted in that.
So, let's take a pause here. Do you want to talk about the biggest fight we ever got in while we were, because I was actually, I don't know if Billy likes to admit this, I was Billy's boss at the Blaze.
Yes.
So do you remember the biggest fight we ever got into?
I do.
Do you want to tell it, or should I?
I want you to tell it, and then I will. Yes.
I'll tell my version. Okay.
So you tell your version.
I was living in Billy and I met in New York City. We were living in New York City. My wife and I lived in New York City for a couple of years. And then the founder of our company moved the headquarters down to Dallas. And all of my wife's family was in Dallas. And they said, hey, we need a representative to go down, represent the website. Will you move down? And I said, yes, right? It made sense. My wife's family was here. I was tired of the cold, all that. So that then meant that Billy and I would talk a lot on the phone instead of in person in the office. And so there was one day, I don't know, like Billy was like really excited about something. He was like all over the place. I mean, it was like, there's a squirrel here. Oh, look, a woodpecker. Oh, look, an armadillo, and so we're talking on the phone and I'm trying to here's the thing, and this is why I eventually left. It was a very stressful job. Like the 24/7 news cycle, it was like I would start at 5 a.m. I would maybe wrap up by 3. And there were days where I wouldn't eat. I wouldn't get up from my desk because it was like before you knew it, like you were just in the rush of it.
It didn't stop.
Right.
It didn't stop. No.
So that's the context for some of this conversation that Billy and I are having. I think either he was pitching me stories or we were trying to talk about something. And so he's all over the place. And so I just stopped and I said, Billy, focus. And boy, you would have thought I told Billy. For some reason, I struck a chord. I don't know if like your dad told you that one time when you were like 6 and it stuck with you. But Billy's like, don't you? Billy's written books about demons. It was almost like a demon came out. He's like, don't you ever tell
I
me to do
manifested
that.
100%. I manifested demons. No, it's so funny because. And we had quite an argument about this. I mean, it developed into and now it's so funny looking back because I wasn't being focused. And anybody knows, and if you've ever messaged with me, texted with me, or done anything, interacted with me, I do that a lot. I'm like, oh, here's my headline or here's my story. And I'm like, and did you see this? And what about that? And by the time it's over, you haven't responded to the first thing, but I've had 4 other conversations with you. So this is just how I am. And I think when I look back at that, it's because I know that that's a weak area for me, right? Like now I can control it more, and I've learned to I have to focus. Not always, I still do the thing with the 14 messages, but at that moment it was like a trigger. Sure. And I also think when you're working and you're like a family and you're working together, you are going to have at the level and the intensity to which we were working and producing. There were days where we wrote 10 stories. Yeah. One person would write. I mean, it was crazy, but I flipped out on you. And I don't even remember. I mean, and I remember you being like, I just remember you, and correct me if I'm wrong, being like, how do we solve this? Because I was so crazy.
Well, and I was kind of like, how did we get here? Now, listen, I'm sure I could have done a much better job of like communicating that to you. I think I just came out, I was like, focus, and probably said it condescendingly. So I own that for sure. But I don't even know. I think by the end of the conversation, we ended up talking for a while. I think we got to a good place. And then I think pretty soon after we started kind of joking about it, like.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
We didn't have, I felt like we didn't have a lot of team problems, right? Like we didn't, but I was crazy. I own it. I will apologize to you 12 years later now, because I don't think I ever did apologize to you either for that.
Apology accepted.
You can tell me to focus anytime now. I can actually handle it. So you just anytime you want.
Well, if I could just tell you to return my text messages and my calls in a timely manner.
I am actually very terrible at both of those things, which that's a whole other conversation.
I'm like going in for emergency root canal. I'm trying to call him to be like, hey, we got to move the podcast. We got to find a different time, as my tooth is erupting. And I mean, he eventually got back to me. And there's God's timing and there's Billy's timing.
Yeah, and my timing is a mess, but it's fun. Every time John called me, it was comical. I said to my wife, poor John, like I would literally start an interview and then you would call and I'd be like, oh no, I'm in the middle of an interview. It was like one of those days, but no, there is not a more rewarding experience, and I know other people feel this way too, than working at the Blaze with that initial team. I don't know that there will ever be another. I've had a lot of great experiences. My current one is great, but that is to that level, and that's a unique thing. Most people don't get that in a career ever, so we are lucky to have that. We really are.
So you have these kind of two, and then we kind of really uncovered a third. That was stupid moment, taking that job in the middle of. You get laid off and you're like, okay, 40%, but some money's better than no money. So I love that. So now, and we kind of started off here, you are what I would say is one of the most prominent, if not the most, I'm just going to say it. You're the most prominent evangelical faith journalist, right? And I say that because it's like there are people at the Washington Post and the New York Times that write about faith, and I'm doing the air quotes, but I don't think they actually are to the level of like, you're living it, right? And that's not a commentary on those people's spiritual walks. What I mean though is like I feel like they're more outside looking in and commentating, and you're kind of commentating from the inside, if that makes sense. So that's where you are today. So here's my question, and I want the audience, because you're going to share this podcast on your social media and people will hear it. What has been, if you could give one, if that's too hard, give me your top three. Top stories that you have done, covered, written, whatever, in your as a faith reporter.
Oh wow, there's two that stand out to me, and one, it's the last story I wrote at the Blaze the day that I signed off. But I had written, it was kind of a two-part. I'd written one about this girl earlier, but long story short, this girl, she was pregnant with twins. Didn't realize it. She knew she was pregnant. She had gone to a clinic. She was going to have an abortion. She went into the clinic, and it just really stuck with me. She went into the clinic. She's waiting there, and there were pro-lifers outside the clinic, not screaming at her, calling her names, but they were holding signs. They were trying to encourage women to come out, and she was in that waiting room, and something told her, get up and go out and talk to those people. And she got up, she went out, she talked to them, and those people, those pro-lifers, they weren't just there protesting, they were there to help, and they came alongside her. They made sure she got the medical care she needed. They threw her a baby shower. She kept her baby, and it turned out to be twins. And then they helped her after, and they formed this amazing relationship with her. And it's such a simple story, but that to me is like showing God's love, right? And it's living it out, not just showing up to protest, but living that out. That story really stands out to me. And I was able to follow up with her before I left the Blaze to see how her kids were doing. At the time, they were 2 years old. So it had been 2 years before that happened. The other story, when the church shooting happened down in Texas a few years back, I hate calling people like after a tragedy. I actually would rather not. I think that one of the cruelest things, and I get it, we want to know the information. So is when journalists are calling people who just had a family member murdered. I hate it. I hate that part of. But something told me to reach out to this family, and it was a family, they had lost like 8 people in that shooting, right? And these grandparents they had lost, grandchildren and I think a son. I can't remember all the details. I ended up getting their phone number and I called them, and the conversation that I had with this grandfather, this elderly man, about the loss, he was a Christian, the loss of his family members, he was rejoicing. He was speaking about how much he loved them, how much he loved the Lord, how he wanted people to see God in the middle of this. And this is like a day after this shooting, right? And it had such a profound impact on me because I thought, I'm annoyed when I go to Starbucks and my coffee's not hot enough. And this man just lost 8 family members and he's rejoicing and praising the Lord. And it was such a challenge to me. And so I know those are simple stories, but those are 2 that, I mean, whenever I can talk to somebody and hear about a transformation or some moment like that, it's such a blessing to me.
Yeah. That is powerful. And I remember, especially that first story, I remember you kind of talking about that and the impact that had on you. And I love that because it shows that there is, I think people who are Christians are called to not just preach against something, but preach for something, right? And so the fact that they not only, their belief and talking about the sanctity of life, they were like, it's not enough just to talk about that and try to convince you not to do that. We're going to provide you with a holistic support. And I think that's amazing. I want to, this is kind of how I ended. And I which by the way, we didn't get a chance to talk about 2 of my, at least, well, one of my favorite stories, which is how Billy ended up in jail, and got out. And so that'll have to be for another podcast. And I'm literally just going to leave that there, and everyone's going to wonder, and they're going to,
I love it.
They're going to like start searching for your name. But what do you feel like is the lesson or the lessons of your That Was Stupid stories?
I don't want to be, and none of us should want to be anywhere God doesn't want us to be. We shouldn't be talking to people God doesn't want us to talk to. We shouldn't be interacting in ways God doesn't want us to interact. We shouldn't be taking journeys He doesn't want us to go on. And I think a lot of us, and in our culture today, we're incentivized to do the opposite of what God wants, right? And yet having a relationship with Him, how do you know those things, right? How do you discern where you're not supposed to be, who you're not supposed to talk, what you're not supposed to do? Is having a relationship, being in Scripture, praying. The more I've gotten in Scripture and the more I've integrated prayer into my life, the clearer everything becomes. It's like cleaning your glasses off, right? It's not foggy anymore. You can see much clearer. And there are times that God still allows some mystery to be there so that you rely on Him. But for me, the biggest lesson was be where God wants me to be always. And that means for me, waking up every day, where do you want me today? Bless every conversation I have today. And that's a simple step, but it actually, every morning, it gets my mind thinking the right way because it's so easy. You can start the day off great. By the end of the day, it's so easy to be on the wrong path if you haven't kept that in mind.
Absolutely, man. My times in the morning have been reinvigorated just within the last week, and I can tell you that starting the day like you've talked about has been life-changing. So I appreciate that. Billy Hallowell, thank you so much for being on the That Was Stupid podcast, for sharing your thoughts, your stories. And I think we're going to have another one because yes, there are plenty more stories, and I think other moments that we can talk about. If people want to find out more about you and your work, I know you have a new podcast, so tell us about that quickly and where people can go.
Absolutely. You can head over to billyhallowell.com and cbnnews.com. But I do have a new podcast called Higher Ground. It's on the Washington Times. And so you can go to the Washington Times. They're often featuring it or Google Higher Ground, Washington Times. And, it's a news podcast. It's reflecting on the news and sort of views of the week in terms of faith and culture and what's going on.
Well, go listen to that. I'm sure if I know you well enough, there will be more That Was Stupid moments that we will cover in the future. So love you, brother, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you.
I hope that you can see how much fun Billy and I have when we get together. We got together when he was in town just a bit ago, and it was just like, like we had never been apart. And so I just love those kind of people. I love those kind of friendships. And how about Billy writing songs? I think that we're going to have to unearth some of those songs and see if he's friends with like Matt Maher. Maybe get like Matt Maher to record one of the Billy collections. We shall see. Anyways, thank you so much for joining us today on the show. As always, please like, subscribe, share. That's the biggest thing you can do. If you like this interview, if you like any of the other interviews in the past season or in this season, please share. And I would be honored to have you spread the message of that was stupid. Hey, we will see you back again for another episode next week, and I cannot wait. Thanks again for joining us.